I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you to today's book launch program, which is very exciting. We are here to celebrate and explore Mel Laytner's new book, What They Didn't Burn: Uncovering My Father's Holocaust Secrets. Mel is a longtime journalist, spending much of his career covering the Middle East as a foreign correspondent for NBC News and United Press International. We hosted Mel at the museum last year for a conversation with Mark Sullivan, author of Beneath a Scarlet Sky. So we're particularly excited to welcome Mel back to our virtual stage as we celebrate the release of his own book. Mel's career shines throughout the book, which melds the intimacy of personal memoir with the rigors of investigative journalism. You can order your copy of What They Didn't Burn: Uncovering My Father's Holocaust Secrets at the link in the Zoom chat. In conversation with Mel this evening is Jane Eisner, an accomplished journalist herself and the former editor-in-chief of The Forward, who now serves as Director of Academic Affairs at the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University, overseeing the Master of Arts program. Both Jane and Mel attended Columbia's journalism school. We'll turn to them in a moment. As they get into this evening's conversation, please feel free to share questions in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can towards the end of the hour. Without further ado, welcome Jane and Mel. Mel, congratulations on the new book. Feel free to get started.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. This is such a pleasure. This book really spoke to me in so many ways. It read like a detective novel in a certain sense, as we witness Mel's search for his father's past. And also, frankly, because I live just a few blocks away from the family store that features prominently in the book, it was a delight for me to learn more about your family here on the Upper West Side and, of course, all over the world. I want to start in the beginning. You know, it's so almost a cliche to ask an author what inspired you to write this book, but I think it's really essential to ask you that question first, because of the bravery that it took and the work that it took to learn more about your father when you did. So tell us a little bit about what went into the decision to actually even write the book.
Well, it started as a story. It didn't start as a book. I found a document and I thought, oh, this will make a great story, linking my father to a German document which proved a part of his narrative. And then several months later, I came across, or I got a hold of another 3 documents, one of which was sort of confirmed a vague story he told me about his attempt to escape. And I thought, well, wait a minute. That's a story that I had trouble believing as a kid. And it's a story I never told my own children. And I just felt that if I have that doubt about my father's own stories, what about all these other stories from other survivors? And I thought, well, every survivor has an amazing story or they wouldn't have survived. So let's see if I can tell the story of one man by tracking his story, and in a sense, also tell the stories of others who were with him. And I was very fortunate.
So let's set the stage for a moment. You grew up on the Upper West Side with a younger brother. Your parents are Holocaust survivors. You had a certain conception of your father. And it was only until after he died that you went on this search. Is that correct? Quickly tell us the backstory there.
Well, it was actually 20 years after he died that I started doing this. My own kids had grown up, and the stories that I had told them, they'd come back at me with, well, what about this? And what about that? And what happened to this character? And what happened to that character? And I didn't know. And I realized that all I had was vague memories of his vaguer stories. So I said, well, there was one story in particular that I liked a lot, and it was about this British POW who at the workplace where they were both interned, he wrote a postcard to my father's family in Brooklyn. And the postcard, my father said, could only say something like, I'm here with my mate Joe. We're doing as well as can be expected, something like that. And I thought that would be great fiction. And my kids wanted me to write about it. And I said, okay, let me just get some context because I don't really have any context. And as soon as I started looking for context, I started tripping over all of this confirmation of where he was, what he was doing. Yes, he was with British POWs. And that's how it really began.
So your father was born in and raised in Poland, and was caught up in the Nazi persecution of Jews, was at a labor camp and at Auschwitz. How many members of his family survived? Well,
he had a sister who had emigrated to the US in 1931. Mm-hmm. He got his mother out of Poland in late 1938 because the signs weren't very good. Mm-hmm. But his family in Poland, his three half-brothers, his sister, they and their families were wiped out. He had a half-sister who was on vacation in Eastern Poland. She was skiing, and that was the part of Poland that the Soviets took over. And she was then sent with her husband to Siberia, as many Jews were. Mm-hmm. So she survived. But aside from that, not a lot of relatives on that side of the family at all. That was about it. Oh, and we had some cousins, yes.
So what was your vision? What was your sense of what your father was like when you were growing up? And then how did that change as you did this research? Because that's really the narrative arc of this book, right? I mean, you had Joe Laytner was one person, and to you as your father, and yet in the incredible research that you did, you found out so many other things about him. And I want to talk about some of the specifics, but first just describe what he was like when you were growing up.
I remember my father as being a very quiet, soft-spoken, passive man. He would read incessantly. As a matter of fact, that's about that, and taking me occasionally to the movies. That was his biggest entertainment. Mm-hmm. We did not do any sports together. He wasn't into sports. He wasn't into watching TV in a big way, though we did. Mm-hmm. He was really into reading. When we had the candy store, which was almost the second part of my childhood, New York at that time had 7 daily newspapers, English newspapers, 2 Yiddish newspapers, a German newspaper, and he read them all. Mm-hmm. He read them all. And from a very young age, he'd point out articles to me that he thought mm-hmm. I should know about. Mm-hmm. And maybe mm-hmm. that affected
maybe that turned you into a journalist.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of challenges in reporting this book, and in some sense, the reportorial challenges are laid out in the book. You see the difficulty you had in obtaining documents that described him. But I'm just wondering, Mel, can you talk a little bit more about the emotional challenges that you faced in doing this kind of excavation of your own family, and especially your father?
It was, well, at first I denied that I would have to. Okay, let's put it on the table.
That you would have to do what?
Get into the emotional side of it.
Oh, I see. So you were just going to be just the reporter.
Exactly. That only the facts, mm-hmm. let them fall where they may, tell the story. As I got into, my colleagues, my former colleagues from UPI, my friends from the J School, they looked at me and they said, you know, you're going to have to explore your relationship with your father, and you're going to have to put yourself out there. I said, no way. Well, they were right, and of course I was wrong, because I realized as I was going through this that part of the story was the arc of discovery, and I don't know if validity is the right word, but I wanted the reader to understand that this was an adventure and this was a trip that I was taking the reader on with me.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted them to appreciate that, yes, you can find a lot of material out there if you're willing to put in the work, if you're willing to use the shoe leather to do the reporting. And I thought just presenting it without telling how I did it and how I evolved emotionally, it would be half a story. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it does take you from the reportorial observer status, like, writing only in the third person as we're taught to do, to really immersing yourself in it. And then, I think one of the reasons the narrative is so compelling is because we see you sort of getting shocked in some ways, and certainly saddened by what you learned. Yeah. So right in the beginning, you meet a fellow survivor, and he says your father was a bastard.
Yeah, but my father's oldest friend.
Yeah, and you were like, wait, what? That's my father?
Exactly.
The quiet guy in the candy store.
Yeah, that was. I had taken my tape recorder with me. At that point, I'd met him. I was a reporter for NBC, and I took my tape recorder because I wanted to hear the story about him. I didn't expect that at all, and it definitely wasn't the dad I grew up with. And it took quite a few years before I was able to circle back to it. I wanted to make one point. The training I received as a journalist made this book possible, because there were times when you cannot let the emotions overwhelm you. I had to keep emotional distance. And I think that the training I got as UPI as a reporter, to write clearly and simply and let the story tell itself, at the end of the day, worked better than if I would try to fill it with adjectives and adverbs, which I really tried to avoid.
So can you tell us about an instance where you really had to just suppress your feelings and get on with the work?
Yeah. Almost more than a year into my search, I was watching TV. I Googled my father's name. Up came a story that I hadn't seen before in the Jerusalem Post that corroborated that document I told you earlier about the diamonds and his escape attempt. And I got a hold of the document. There's a 2-page SS document full of stamps and initialed approvals and everything. And he was sentenced to 25 lashes. And that's enough to stop you in your tracks when you read that, because Dad never spoke to me about that. And then I flip it over and I'm reading more, and I'm trying to figure out, how am I ever going to describe this? How am I going to convey my feelings about seeing this? And right at the bottom of page 2, it's a flip over document, I noticed that the sentence was carried out and it gave a prisoner's name and his number. And I flipped off emotionally like that. And I said, okay, who was this guy? What makes a guy like this tick? And, doing what we do, I tracked him down. I tracked down documents from Holland. He was from Holland, from Germany. I spoke to survivors who remembered him. And that's how I coped with a lot of this stuff. I went back to reportorial 101 and tried to get on with the story.
So you mentioned the diamonds. Tell us a story about the diamonds.
Well, I first heard about him when I was maybe 7, 8 years old. My father just was telling me a story that he pulled his back. He had to go to the infirmary, and he bribed the guy who runs the infirmary with a very tiny diamond. And the point of the story wasn't the diamond. The point of the story was that the Gestapo came, or the SS came, every now and then, and just would clear out the infirmary and send everybody to the Auschwitz-Birkenau gas chambers. And I never really thought about asking about that. And then this document comes from Auschwitz, where I have his signed confession that in fact he had sold or traded 15 diamonds on the black market. And where does a prisoner in a concentration camp get a hold of 15 diamonds? Well, a cousin 3 years earlier had sent me an email saying that she remembered Dad telling her a story how a Belgian Jew who was dying of typhoid, my father was giving him water and food, passed away. And before he died, he told my father where he hid a sack of 15 diamonds, or excuse me, a sack of diamonds. This is how you put a story together.
So your father had rescued those diamonds and then used them very cleverly to do what?
Well, it's pretty clear that he bribed or that he paid off British POWs and paid some to Polish, that got to the Polish underground so that he could get on with this escape attempt, which involved both British POWs and the Polish underground and the Gestapo. It was clear that he used the diamonds judiciously at different points to get out of trouble or to make life a little bit easier for him. He didn't use them recklessly. It was also clear, he told me a story at the very end, where he didn't have any more diamonds. And he couldn't bribe his way out of what he wanted to. Mm-hmm. And ironically, that also saved his life, because he was put on another death march. And if he hadn't, then he probably would have been executed, along with several hundred others.
I have to say that as many descriptions that I've read and seen of life at Auschwitz and at the labor camps, and I have visited and reported on Auschwitz myself, I just really found myself haunted by some of what you said. And you have a section in there that talks about bread, how your father loved to eat bread. And it harkens back to the meager rations that they were given. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I was thinking about that again just today, how poignant that is to have gone from one situation to another in one's life.
Well, Dad loved making sandwiches, the truth, and he would really get into it with the ingredients spread out, and he'd cut the bread. He preferred pumpernickel, dark bread, and he would build a sandwich and he'd lecture me on it. And okay, Dad, I got it. I remember it from last year. I remember it from the year before. And I used that vignette to get into the chapter about survival stories, because everything, when you read the testimonials and you speak to survivors, everything was in terms of rations of bread. Everything was calculated in rations of bread. A half a ration, 2 rations, 1 ration. If you needed this, it would cost that much. You'd split your ration. You would pay a finder's fee in bread for somebody who did a favor for you. It was all around bread. And it
was the currency.
That was the currency of the camp. That was the currency of the camp. People hoarded bread. They had to learn how to hoard bread, or they would starve. The other thing I found kind of interesting when I got into it was that the Germans gave skilled workers 1,700 calories a day, and unskilled workers, 1,300 calories a day. Mind you, it takes 2,500 calories to do a day's physical labor. So who got the 13 and who got the 17? Well, if you were a dressmaker, a boot maker, you were taken care of because you could make custom boots and clothes. If you were an electrician, a welder, a metal worker, a machinist, you were okay. If you were a university professor, a journalist, a sociologist, a philologist, anything with psychology, anything with IST at the end, you know, you were a serf. You were a serf. And so the skilled laborers who could make things that the Germans valued, like boots, they were the nobility, or they were the royalty. They were the royalty.
And your father was a welder, and that's what helped him.
My father was a welder, electro welder, and he was therefore nobility. So the top of the food chain, if you will, were the people like dressmakers, tailors. Then came the nobility, the electricians, the welders. And then came the serfs, the teachers, the lawyers, the accountants. And they were given the worst jobs.
So you recount in the book, Mels, so many times that your father would say to you, well, I survived because I was lucky.
Yeah.
And, you know, clearly when you read his story, you see that this was not just luck at work. This was a lot of bravery and chutzpah and cleverness and ruthlessness. And so tell us a little bit more about that. Like, how did that revelation affect you?
Oh, I mean, for 20 years after my father died, I thought he was this passive guy who was quiet and basically type B personality. And then I came across, you know, solid evidence to the fact that he was very proactive and he took a lot of risks. And I realized that the war really changed him. And that the father I knew growing up, no doubt was suffering from depression and no doubt had some form of PTSD. But who knew back then? No, our parents' generation didn't go to shrinks. They didn't know from shrinks.
Right.
So I had an uncle who I to this day is my hero. And he fought in the British Army during the war. And he was sort of a role model. And because he was proactive, he did things. And I never looked at my father that way until I started digging up these stories and confirming them. And then I appreciate him now much more as a man than just a loving dad. And I think it reflects what a lot of my peers also probably experienced with their parents, because they didn't talk as much as we thought they did. Dad sanitized his stories for me. That's very clear. You know.
So in your course of your reporting, you spent a lot of time in Poland. Went there, I think, 3 times, was that?
3 times, yes.
Yes. So I want to talk a little bit about that because it's, you know, there's definitely a trend in among American Jews to go back to Poland to do some sort of roots trip, but also to see the camps and to see the new museum in Warsaw and the JCC in Krakow. I have done that on a reporting trip as well. But I had very mixed feelings when I went there. And I'm wondering if you can just lead us through some of the experiences that you had as you were reporting in Poland, impressions that left you feeling good about what you saw or not so good.
Well, it's a mixed bag, but I have to say that the Polish people that I was in touch with and the researchers whom I met and the people I've been in touch with since are wonderful. And they're very helpful and just warm people. you go see places, and of course, the history of Poland isn't so wonderful when it comes to Jewish history there. And I always wondered whether my father would have, frowned or been opposed to me taking these trips. But I found that I didn't run into any anti-Semitism myself. Put that on the table. And over the years, I found that fears that I had that certain things would be forgotten were actually memorialized.
Mm-hmm.
The Blechhammer camp, from the first time I was there to the last time I was there 9 years later.
So the Blechhammer camp, let's just, for our viewers, is the slave labor camp where your father was
Yes.
for?
Yes, it was a subcamp of Auschwitz.
Yes.
You could go to the Blechhammer camp. There's a phone app that you can download in 5 languages, and it'll educate you in maybe a minute and a half about what went on there. When I was there the first time, there was nothing there like that.
Mm.
And so that's an evolution in a positive sense. There was the ghetto from where my father was deported and his family basically torn apart. That was a decrepit, falling down building with a plaque on the wall that turns out a month after I was there was torn down. And they put up a rather proper monument with another plaque. But this is at a place where tourists won't go.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you really have to seek it out. You have to go to this village for a specific reason. And the plaque is only in Polish.
Mm-hmm.
So who are they aiming it for? They're not aiming it for tourism.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, Kazimierz and part of Krakow, definitely Holocaust tourism is alive and well and thriving.
Yeah.
And that gives you pause. And as I ask in the book, what came first?
Yeah.
Desire to commemorate and memorialize a vanished community, and then tourism grew up around it, or with people cashing in on tourist dollars after Schindler's List made visiting Krakow popular.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I just don't know.
Mm. So you really had to immerse yourself in the world of survivors. And while I know you grew up as the child of survivors, as you said, your parents didn't really talk much about their experiences. And then in the course of the book, you're seeking out all these friends and people who knew your father who were survivors. What did that change your perception of them and what they experienced and how that affected them?
I don't know if I had a perception going into it. I sort of were taking it as they came, and you have to be patient when you speak to them. They have a story, and they fall in 2 categories. One, they don't really want to talk about it, and 2, they don't want to stop talking about it because they feel that nobody has paid attention to their story.
Right.
So, there's a balance there. I found, for the most part, the people who I sought out and the people who I interviewed to be very cooperative, very helpful, very rational, and very centered. Centered might be the best word when I think of it.
Wow. Now, these were people who were already in their 70s, 80s?
80s, by and large. Between the time I started interviewing them and now, just about all of them have passed. And when I interviewed them, I could see at times they were being very patient because I was asking dumb questions. But I appreciated that a lot. It was an honor to be able to speak to them and learn from them. And it was also a responsibility. All of a sudden, it's not just about Dad. There's a bigger picture here that you have to be responsible for, which again, I wanted to copper bottom it with evidence and fact-based proof and evidence. So for every story, I try to get corroboration. I try to get 2 sources for every major assertion in the book and story in the book. Dialogue and documents, a version and a document, something. That became a mission.
So in the book, you decry, and I'm just going to quote here, the way, quote, "We, the children of survivors, deserve a merit badge for the suffering of our parents." And you were kind of pushing back on this notion that somehow, as a child of survivors, you were in some sort of special category and had inherited a certain kind of trauma. Now that you've gone through this whole process, do you still feel this way? I mean, wasn't there the transmission of generational trauma in your family?
Are we talking biological or emotional?
I mean, how could you separate them?
Well, I have a problem with, look, it's clear, just if I were a Tutsi in Rwanda, I would have been affected by that experience. And I probably would have passed on certain warnings and cautions to my kids, either consciously or unconsciously. And I'm sure my parents did the same. Where I have a problem is the assertions that as a group, children of survivors are, quote, damaged. And with that, as you know, a few years ago, there was some learned articles that postulated that the trauma experienced by our parents affected their genes, and that in turn was passed on to us, inherited genetically. And then, of course, a couple of years later, there was another study that refuted that 100%. So there you go. And I have them both footnoted in the book. Yeah, it's a balance between remembering and being aware and wallowing in it. And my parents didn't wallow in it. And they certainly didn't let me wallow in it. And they didn't let my brother wallow in it. So we have to be, we can't end up pitying ourselves for what our parents went through. They went through it. We were blessed by growing up in the United States.
Do you think that the Jewish community at large has learned that lesson too? Or do we still focus too much on it, or perhaps not enough?
You know, I always felt that we focused too much on it and it was terrible. And then a good friend of mine looked at me and said, well, what about the 800-pound gorilla in the room? I said, yeah, you're right. I've spent a few years overly focusing on it myself. So I'm probably carrying around stuff that I'm not fully aware of. It's a balance. It's a balance. We have to maintain our commitment to remember the past with a balance of living the present and making a life for our own kids. It's not for me to say whether we're overly focused on it or not. I wrote this book. I did it to honor my father. I did it also so my kids and their kids will know a piece of history, family history, that otherwise would just evaporate. Who is it that said, don't worry about the future, every 100 years, new people, new problems? Do we really know and remember the 1918 pandemic? I mean, let's get real.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think there's a civic purpose in what you did too, isn't there? I mean, you're showing how extremely planned and thoughtful, if you will, and documented this genocide was.
Yes, that's true. And part of the gee whiz of this was to show other people like myself just how much you can find out, and how much is out there. Oral history by itself needs to be confirmed, and documents by themselves become, if we only rely on these documents, we're basically telling the perpetrator's story. So we have to combine the two. We have to meld the two, and we can reinforce the story and the, if I could say so, the truth behind them. And that all of that came into play when I was writing this.
So we're going to take some audience questions in just a moment, but I did want to ask you about the book's title. I read a wonderful little story about how that came about. Can you share that with us?
Sure. I was taking a writer's workshop, and part of the lesson of the day was, or the exercise of the day was, come up with a title for your book. And, you know, my book is not quite a memoir. It's not an investigative long form journalism exactly. It's not history. It's sort of a mishmash. And I was having trouble coming up with, how do I do this? And a woman from the Midwest her book was going to be on quilting your history, a quilting pop-up book. So help me. And she spoke with Jimmy Stewart Twang, and recalled how she was watching this documentary once on TV, and at the end of the documentary, there was images of all of these barrels and the Germans shoveling documents down the barrels and burning their evidence. And she turned to me and said, "Why don't you just call it what they didn't burn?" And there was this dead silence around the table. And I said, "Boy, that's it. You got it." And that's how the title came.
That's wonderful.
That's the truth. Strange, but true.
That's a great story. So I want to get to some questions from our audience. Gerard Coffey asks, of all the sources you interviewed, who was the most valuable and who was the least reliable?
Yeah, Duke. The most valuable may have been Walter Spitzer, because as I wrote.
But tell us more about who Walter Spitzer is.
Spitzer was my father's friend from, who was a 16-year-old boy when my father was 30, in the ghettos, and then in the labor camps, and then through the death marches. And then serendipitously, they met in France when my father was a refugee there, and so was Walter. And they remained friends until my father passed away. And I didn't realize Walter would be so central to the book until I finished writing it. And then I realized he's right through it, because he knew my father at different phases, and he wrote his own autobiography, which helped a lot as well. But I had hours of interview with him, and he became very good. The least reliable.
I just want to say one more word, though, about Spitzer, which is that you have copies of some of his drawings in the book.
Yes. He did a series of drawings in 1945, right after the war, which are housed at the museum at Kibbutz Lachmei Hagetot in Nahariya, Israel. And I got permission from the museum to reproduce some of the images in the book of his experiences. And I have to say, they pretty much track with what many other testimonies and evidence. You know, they're not just made up images. They're pretty accurate. By the way, Walter just passed away this past April at age 94 of COVID. He was in Paris. He went to the hospital for one thing, and he contracted COVID, and he passed away at 94. I had seen him in February 2020, right before COVID. I was in Paris, and I visited him.
And the least reliable source.
That's tough. I don't want to name names, but there actually was a book published that's been around, and when I got into it, it was all his memories, and memories are faulty. Mm. He got his dates wrong. He got his people wrong. And so I had to put that book to the side. I mean, it was a go-to book because it was so popular, but so it wasn't an interviewee or a testimonial as much as a published book that I just felt sorry for.
Mm. Yeah. Wow. So a viewer named Nancy asked, what happened to your grandparents?
Okay. My grandmother on my father's side, in other words, my grandmother, moved to the United States in 1938. The handwriting was pretty much on the wall, what was going on, and my father got her out of the country. My grandfather on my father's side, in other words, my father's father, died of pneumonia in 1931. So he died before the war. On my mother's side, my mother had been an orphan. Her mother had passed away when she was, I believe, 7 or 9 years old. Mm. So she basically took care of her father. And she and her father, my mother was Hungarian, and she was involved with the Hungarian deportation in the spring of '44. And I tracked her story down to a degree. And she was separated from my grandfather at the infamous ramp in Auschwitz-Birkenau. She was selected for work. He wasn't.
Wow. You know, it's interesting, Mel, because you focus so much on your father in this book, and your mother is a character for sure. She's there, but not the focus. I'm just wondering what went into that decision.
Well, you're right, what you know. And Mom didn't talk about the war. She only told us about the evening that she arrived on Erev, the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, and in 4 or 5 sentences how she got separated from her father. And I didn't have anything to go on until, I don't know, 2014, 2015, a friend of hers in Israel, the daughter who had passed away, her daughter said, well, didn't you know your mother was part of this group called the Five Sisters? And they took care of each other in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and then they went to, I had no clue. And she arranged a meeting with the 3 of the 5 that were alive, and I turned on my tape recorder for a couple of hours and I let them talk. But that's all I ever got. She never talked about the war. She never wanted to talk about the war. She was, you know, she suffered for it, I think.
Wow. A reader, Andre Weiss, asked, how did your father's survivorship form his attitude on Israel?
You know, there's I don't know if, well, if he wouldn't have survived, he wouldn't have had an opinion about Israel. But no, Israel and that's just a given. It's not you breathe air, you know, you support Israel. I don't think it was ever an issue or a question or a doubt in his mind. I think he came to the United States for a couple of reasons. First, his mother was in the United States, and he was tired. You know, he'd seen a lot of death, and he had the opportunity. And he did not elect to go to Palestine. He went to, I guess, to be with his family, that what was left of it in America.
So I want to just read a question from Joan. As a person who lived on the Upper West Side in the 1970s, I know the name Laytner. As a brilliant community-based merchant family who knew other storied Jewish families that worked together to serve their neighbors. Knowing your father's background, I marvel at his resilience. Do you care to comment on that?
I don't know what the question is, but Look, we're an immigrant story. It's happening today with South Asians, and it's happening today with other minority groups. We came, and he worked in a factory. He worked as a presser in a factory. He tried several times and failed to climb out of the piecework world. And my mother was the one who pushed the family to get the candy store, which meant 60, 70-hour work weeks. But that brought us into the working middle class. Get his teeth fixed, but we were still, Alan and I were still going to CCNY, or we weren't going to college. That was our option. And then, little by little, he became a more successful businessman. And it's just the way I think immigrant families in this country have always pulled themselves up or tried. That he was, and he understood that. He used to tell me that it just takes one employee to ruin your good name. You could spend 20 years building it up, and the one employee who insults the customer or is rude, that'll destroy it. And that was an important life lesson.
But this wasn't a business that you particularly wanted to go into.
No, I knew I was going to be a reporter from age 14. and my father, my parents never really tried to dissuade me like they could, right?
Yeah.
But my father, I think I was already headed to graduate school at Columbia, and I'd been working 3 years part-time at the New York Daily News. And my father sat me down one day, and I'm sure my mother put him up to it. And he looks at me and he goes, "Okay, you want to write? Write. What are you going to do to earn a living?" He just couldn't see it,
Did he live long enough to see your success in journalism?
Such as it was. Yes, he did. I became a staff correspondent overseas. I got to work for a network, which at the time,
it's a big deal.
Still
is a big deal.
No, I had a good run, and I think they respected it.
Oh, that's good. Well, I think we may only have time for one more question, but there's one from Stephen Lewis that I find really poignant. Beyond the uniquely fascinating story itself, what do you want your readers to understand about the larger human truths that came out of the Holocaust?
Whoa, that's a heavy question.
Yeah, that's why I figured I'd leave it till the end.
The larger human truths that came out of the Holocaust. The larger human truths. That we all go through unbelievable stuff that we cannot imagine what man can do to man, and yet we persevere. We not only persevere, we thrive, we overcome, we fight back, more than survive. And all of those survivors who I had the honor of interviewing, and all of those testimonials that I viewed, and all of those books that I absorbed, these people came out the other side damaged, hurt, but determined to build new lives and get on with it. And that's very important. I think that's a lesson we should all keep in mind. When I was asked, when friends and my daughters would go, "Oh, this COVID, it's terrible. We got to stay at home. I'm locked in the room. I can't go out. This is awful." I go, "Yeah, Anne Frank was in an attic for 2 years. Get over it." And that's the kind of resilience you need. We shouldn't have to go through the Holocaust, but it's an important life lesson.
Oh, that's lovely. I just want to say for myself too, I think what I found so important about your book too was that you were unsparing in the way you described the lengths to which your father had to survive and go to. And we tend to sanitize and immortalize survivors, and it was hell on earth. And sometimes you had to do things or accept things. You know, you had to bribe German officers or accept 25 lashes or whatever it is to survive. And we shouldn't, and yet that spirit was maintained. But it you know, sometimes I think that early on we used to sort of say, why did the Jews just submit to this? And reading your book, you realize they did not just submit to it.
I think that at the end of it, at the end of the day, the important thing to keep in mind is that those that came out of it at the other end came out by and large with the idea of building families and starting new lives. And by and large, many of them did. That's an important lesson.
Yeah.
And something that I think is universal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Gosh, Mel, thank you so much. It's really, it was a joy to read your book. Sometimes difficult, but still a real pleasure. And it certainly is wonderful to be able to talk to you. I look forward to the day we can do this actually in person, but I know that we all feel that way.
Yeah.
So thank you very, very much. Ari, back over to you.
Mel, I want to echo Jane's thanks for being with us this evening and for writing this book, which is a great contribution to not only your family, but to the world, as we all seek to understand the Holocaust through personal stories, which are as important as they are challenging. You can order your copy of What They Didn't Burn, Uncovering My Father's Holocaust Secrets at the link in the Zoom chat. We recorded this evening's discussion, and you'll receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording and a link to order the book. It'll also be available on the museum's YouTube channel. Everything that we do at the museum, including our book talks and our exhibitions, is made possible through donor support. So we offer our thanks to those of you with us this evening who are supporters of the museum. To those of you who aren't, you can support also at the link in the Zoom chat. Mel, Jane, we're so grateful to you both. Mel, I would turn it to you if you have any parting thoughts.
No, I would like to thank you, and I appreciate my friends and people I've seen pop up under the chat. Thank you for joining me in this. And if you haven't purchased the book yet, what are you waiting for? And if you have read the book, you know, leave a review. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks, Mel. Thanks, Jane.